Hello, thank you. I've prepared a lecture in which we would focus on the issue of microbiomes, human microbiome, and the associated issue of a new product that we are introducing, which is called microbiome cups. The first slide that you can see is supposed to express one particular thing. As we are all sitting or standing here, we all have our unique microbiomes, or our microbiome makeup, which is unique. When we say microbiome, we can imagine a set of all microorganisms that can be found in and on our body. That means that microbiome includes our skin microflora, intestinal microflora, our oral microflora, and the thing that is discussed a lot now is a lung microbiome, which means that we have a load of microorganisms in our lungs, and in the very last topic, which is discussed a lot, and it's the blood microbiome. Who would ever think that even in our blood, especially if there's something wrong with our intestine, a whole number of microorganisms can live in our blood, and they can cause loads of modern illnesses. So, as to the first clarification of the terms, when I use the term microbiome and microflora, please forgive me, I switch between them. So I'm talking about the same thing. Scientists like changing the terminology from time to time, so 4 years ago they said, well, we don't have any flowers in our intestines, so they renamed the set of microorganisms into a microbiome. If we look at the microbiome, just for the explanation, in our intestines, and I'm going to talk especially about the intestinal microbiome, there are bacteria and viruses. We have about 10 to the magnitude of 14 or 15, and these viruses will have a huge therapeutic potential because it's becoming obvious that they can have a good effect in treating salmonella and other diseases. So the whole scientific world is focusing on the use of viruses, so-called phagobiotics. Then I will stop with bacteria that is closely connected to our product. But now I will jump to the yeast. When you hear the word yeast, people usually imagine wine, beer, or health issues that bother both men and women. But I would like to stress that the yeast, if they are in a balanced form, they should be in our organism because they are responsible for the production of a whole number of vitamins, and they can be very positive to our life system. Currently there is a huge campaign around against parasites and protozoans. Yes, there are parasites that are dangerous for our lives. On the other hand, in all our intestines of all of us, there are numerous protozoans that could be classified as pseudoparasites, and these are important for the correct function of the immunity system. So there were some studies in which they managed to kill a majority of these protozoans, and people without them had very high risk of various health problems. To complete the introduction, I mentioned oral microflora. Our mouth is one huge microflora reservoir. We have about 700 different species of bacteria, and these very often influence the structure of our intestinal microbiome. Now we know that there is a connection between the oral microflora and so-called idiopathic intestinal influences like Crohn's disease and so on. Patients that suffer from the Crohn's disease have an increased concentration of a bacteria called Klebsiella pneumoniae. Primarily, this bacteria is supposed to be in the mouth, but these ill patients have a high concentration of it in the intestine. And it was discovered that the mouth is like a reservoir that serves for the repeated colonization of these patients. How did the scientists discover it? They collected the bacteria from the mouth and transferred it into laboratory mice and discovered that if they colonized the mouse with the bacteria, it developed similar inflammations like people. Our oral and intestinal microflora is influenced by the environment in which we live. The left picture, just for your interest, indicates how kissing influences our oral microbiome. One 10-second long kiss represents an intensive migration of nations among bacteria, counting about 80 million bacteria. So you can see how microbiome responds a whole number of influences. So principle number one, if someone suffers from repeated infects in the mouth, in the sinus or in the throat, the first thing that the family should do is to separate the hygienic tools, which means the toothbrush in one cup or the same holder. If the patient has repeated tonsillitis, when they start the treatment, they should buy a new toothbrush and at the end to do the same thing. These are the basic hygienic rules, but 90% of the population does not follow that. Even doctors don't point it out. This takes us to things that we are interested in, that we deal with. We have our laboratories within INBIT at the university campus. We and our team, we deal with the research of the intestinal microbiome. Our intestinal microbiome is a huge amount of bacteria. It's estimated that we have about 1.5 to 2 kilograms of clear bacteria mass. So if you close your eyes and you can imagine that there are 2 kilos of bacteria in you. It's a very interesting piece of information for me as a microbiologist, but for a common person, I don't know how much interesting it is. In the intestines, if we go further into the details, we have about 1,000 bacteria types or species. And the number of bacteria reaches the number of 1 to the magnitude of 14th, which means trillions of bacteria. Bacteria, they are one order higher than the number of our somatic cells that form our body. So now we can ask a question: who's the Lord, or who's the Master? Do we keep the bacteria in order to survive, or is that the bacteria that keep us so that we survive and do what we are supposed to do for them, to serve them? We know very little about the microbiome, even though there are numerous studies, but the more the scientific teams deal with that, the more they realize that they have more questions. Until recently, it was believed that we have about 50 to 70 types of bacteria in our intestines, and it was given by the great limitation of the cultivation methods. Cultivation is a process which helps us to identify bacteria. If you came to a hospital with your diarrhea or something, they would cultivate the microbes from your stool, they would use agar, and they would cultivate 40, 50 types of bacteria. They will tell you if salmonella or something else, and that was it. Today we know, thanks to molecular biology, that the vast majority of bacteria types cannot be calculated. So today we know that we have about 1,000 types of bacteria. Here you can see how the whole science was limited. If we look at the intestinal microbiome of a healthy person, such a person really has about 1,000 species of bacteria, plus minus. And when we perform analysis of patients who suffer from chronic autoimmune diseases, have idiopathic inflammations like Crohn's disease, ulcerous colitis, so we can see at first hand that something is incorrect in their bodies, because they don't have 1,000 bacteria in their intestines, but they have only about 450, 600, 700. As much as we cooperate with the Masaryk University, they analyzed a boy, and this boy was after appendicitis, And he really had problems. For that reason, he had to be long-term treated with antibiotics. Numerous problems developed with this boy, really, starting with the skin, the intestines, autoimmune reactions, and when an analysis was performed, it was discovered that only 1/10 of bacteria could be found in his intestines. When we look at that, as common people don't look at that as rocket science, if there are so many bacteria, more than our body cells, the bacteria really control us and control much more than we are willing to admit. And the latest studies in the last years prove this. Otherwise, if you look at the genetic equipment, the bacteria have 100 times more genes than we do have, than form the whole body of us. So bacteria rule. And what do they rule? As number one, I mentioned immunity. Danone 10 years ago performed a lot of promotion, Alka-Say Immunitas, you saw it 20 times a day on the TV, and now everybody knows that we have 60 to 70% of our immunity in the intestines. But what is not known, or was not promoted so much, was the link between the intestinal microbiome with numerous diseases, where we would not expect that. If we look at rheumatic arthritis, frequently it begins on the level of intestinal microbiome. Diabetes, obesity, everything is linked to intestinal microflora. If we look at allergies, atopic dermatitis, or numerous non-specific inflammations like the Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, there is always a link with the intestinal microflora. And that was one of the reasons why we started dealing intensively with developing new probiotics that would contain the strains that could be linked to numerous immunity issues. Why does the microflora influence the immunity? There are 2 kilograms of bacteria. We've been living with them for a million years. There's been symbiosis created between us, and bacteria know well how to control our immunity system, not to be flown away or excluded. So bacteria are able to control the inflammation processes and chronic ones, and on the other hand, in case of acute infects, they are able to speed them up and to support immunity. For that reason, there is a close link of the intestinal microbiome to the immunity of the respirational system, and when we deal with repeated infects of breathing apparatus, we shouldn't deal just with the spot where the inflammation can be found, but also at the intestines. If we look at repeated urinary or vaginal infections, they are always connected with intestinal microflora. In chronic patients, we always see the radical reduce in the variability of bacteria. I've already mentioned that the intestinal microbiome and obesity go hand in hand. If we look at the microbiome of an obese person and the microbiome of a slim person, we will always find a difference. Scientists always tried to prove how the microbiome influences obesity, whether there's really a link or whether it's just a hypothesis. They designed wonderful experiments. You may have heard of them. The experiments were based on scientists taking identical twins, where one of the twins was slim and the other obese, which itself is quite difficult to find. And then they collected the intestinal microflora from the stool and transferred it into laboratory rats. And they discovered that if they took the microflora from the obese person and transferred it to the laboratory rat, the rat, in spite of being on a diet, being on a low-calorie fodder, thanks to receiving the flora, it was getting fatter and fatter. And on the contrary, when they took the microflora from the slim person and moved it or transferred it to another laboratory rat, in spite of being fed fully, it could overeat, the rat, thanks to the slim microflora, it was not getting fat and had a lower body mass index. So in this you can see that probiotics or the change of the microbiome is one of important steps or factors that should be included in the treatment if people deal with obesity or overweight. In a moment, I mention microbiome transplantation, and it proved that if there is actually there was a case study when they transferred microbiome from an obese person into a slim person who had health issues, and through the transfer of the microbiome, the slim person started getting fat in spite of living on a diet and living healthily. So really, in this area of obesity treatment, we will still see a lot of new information. Then, obviously, microflora in our bodies influences our psychic situation, our moods. Today, there are numerous scientific conferences called gut-to-brain axis. We really have the second brain in our intestines. If you are stressed, if you are nervous, many people have intestinal problems, spasms or diarrhea. It's determined by the fact that our brain communicates with our intestinal brain, and this intestinal brain includes also the intestinal bacteria. Those 2 kilograms of bacteria influence the production of many other neurotransmitters, which means matters that affect our brain or moods. The first one I want to list is serotonin. Serotonin is a hormone of happiness, and believe me or not, 95% of it is in our guts. Only 5% is in the brain. So our feelings of happiness are primarily generated in our bowels. In the same way, the intestinal bacteria produce the GABA acid. GABA is a method that can be found in many medical drugs used for treating schizophrenia or depressions. It's a method that calms the organism. And again, it's one of the factors by which the intestinal bacteria contribute to reducing the stress and are calming down. And if you look at autistic children that have serious behavioral problems, now we know that autism has partly been caused also by the change in the intestinal microflora. Autistic children have different microflora than healthy children. According to some studies, just a mere supplementation of probiotics will obviously not cure the children, but it can modify their behavior and to reduce the typical symptoms of autism. Scientists have proved in many studies that the probiotic supplementation can influence the behavior of laboratory animals. I don't know if I can say it here, but take it as a scientific view. No animal has been killed in that, but the experiments are based on the fact that there are 2 groups of rats. One of them gets probiotics, the other one doesn't get them. And what do the scientists do? They have a special aquarium, drop the rats in the water and let them drown. Not drown to death, but they watch them, according to a certain assessment figure, how the rats behave under the stress. And the score is clearly defined, and it's been obvious that the supplemented rats, those that have been using the probiotics, were much calmer. Similarly, if they let the rats in a maze, the rat is really stressed, not knowing how to get out. And again, according to their scores, rats that are on the probiotic supplementation are much calmer. Numerous studies now show that probiotics have their potential for supportive supplementation or treatment of depressions. Really, depressions are always connected to the change of the intestinal microflora. If you analyze the microbiome in the intestines in patients that suffer from depressions and those that are calm, they are okay with their lives and happy, you can clearly see a difference. So one of the factors that is contributing to the creation of depressions, apart from genetic predispositions and illnesses and stresses, is also our intestinal microbiome. For that reason, many researches deal with the supplementations in patients that suffer with depressions, and it's a topical issue. If you look at the Czech Republic, for example, the statistics say it clearly that there are about 750 or 800,000 people that suffer from depressions. It's a hot topic. Then you may believe that I'm telling you nonsense here, but this is a new topic, about 4 months old only. That's the relationship of our microbiome and sexual preferences. So far it's been proved only in insects, so don't take it too seriously. Scientists now published a wonderful study within which they watched the sexual behavior of fruit flies. Drosophila Malogaster is small flies, like if you want to have your own slivovitz and have it in a barrel, that's the small flies that you see flying out. If you have fruit somewhere and the flies, tiny flies, fly around, that's them. So the scientists discovered that for an unknown reason that they tend to mate within certain groups. For that reason, they established an experiment. Took one group of these fruit flies that they kept on maltose and the other group on starch. And when they mixed these flies, put them in one container or one space, they discovered that the flies have their preference in mating in the same group on the maltose medium or on the starch medium. This is not saying so much, but the experiment continued. Then they took their bacteria, then they treated them with antibiotics, which means they killed all the microflora in the bodies of these flies, and then they colonized them again with the bacteria, and discovered that the type of colonization influenced the sexual preference in mating of these flies. So they basically mated with each other those that had the same microbiome. So perhaps for you it might be sort of an excuse after being treated by antibiotics if your partner stops being attractive to you. It's not your fault. It's the problem of the antibiotic treatment and your damaged microflora. So be patient, don't give up, and it will go back to normal and everything will work as it used to. And then, obviously, in case of women, the change of microbiome is closely connected with the levels of hormones. So during the menopause, there is a huge reduction of the lactobacillus. Can I ask you a question? The fruit flies are so tiny, how could they tell one from the other? They had marked them. There are really different alternatives. You can have a fruit fly with yellow bags or with black bags, so for example like that. But it can be clearly done. I did my own diploma thesis on fruit flies, so I know that they can be differentiated by the size of them, because there are different strains of them. If we go back to the menopause, the problem of women in the menopause is the reduction of the bacilli. Generally, the female microbiome is differs from the male one. And the female microbiome depends a lot on estrogen. Women with a lot of estrogen have an increased number of lactobacilli. Once the level of estrogen reduces in the body, the lactobacilli start leaving the intestine, and that's the reason why women, which is epidemiologically clear, that this very change of the microbiome is linked to numerous civilization diseases like the idiopathic intestinal infections. Also, the chronic fatigue syndrome is linked with this, and it's more frequent in women. And last but not least, our skin is also linked or reflecting the intestinal microbiome. Many people go to see their dermatologist because of the atopic dermatitis or an eczema. The doctor prescribes the corticoids, they put the ointment on, everything works fine, everybody's happy, but now it's becoming clearer and clearer that this topical treatment of the atopic dermatitis is just scraping by, because many of these patients are patients suffering from the non-specific inflammation in the guts. They don't know about it, they don't feel it, they just go more frequently to the toilet or have more diarrhea, but the inflammation presents itself in the skin. And that's the reason why we try to combine the probiotic strains in SMBO that have clinical studies linked to atopic dermatitis and its prevention. As I said, that our intestinal microbiome influences our mood. So what's interesting from the pharmaceutical point of view is that our bacteria in the guts influence the permeability of the hematoencephalic barrier, which is the barrier separating the brain from the rest of the body and protects the brain. The probiotic supplementation can increase this permeability for certain medicals. So this can influence the efficiency of various medical preparations. What's also interesting is the relationship of our microbiome with taste. A recent study proved that our bacteria are so clever that they can generate feelings of appetite for certain type of food. So if you feel like something sweet or want chocolate, you're not to blame. It's the problem of your guts, problem of your intestinal bacteria. The bacteria through nervus vagus, which connects the intestine with the brain, they are able to send a message and to call, like, feed us with this, this is what we feel like, this is what we need, give us this sweet sugar so that we can multiply. And on the contrary, bacteria are also able to generate feelings of disgust, disappetite to certain food. So if you dislike something, if you are disgusted by that, one of the reasons might be your intestinal microflora. What's really interesting is the relationship of our microbiome to the development, to our autogenetic development. I started with the first one. The first point was the method of birth giving, but I will go one step back. It's becoming clearer and clearer that the microbiome in our organism is also influenced by the prenatal development. Today there are numerous hypotheses pointing out that mothers actually give their children some bacteria during the prenatal phase. No one knows how this is happening. No one knows the method or the way how it's happening. But what we know, that a child, when it is born and we take the first stool from the child, it already contains many bacteria similar to the mother's bacteria. And to make it more complicated, there are numerous studies proving that if a mother has an increased risk of, let's say, atopic dermatitis in their family anamnesis, if they use certain probiotics, the mother can significantly reduce the risk for the child to suffer from the same disease. Atopic dermatitis is a big issue. In the EU, there are about 15 to 20% of all the population suffering. A huge number of people. The promising piece of information is that unless the child falls ill with atopic dermatitis till the age of 5, then the risk reduces down to 5 to 10% of falling ill On the other hand, it's also linked with the overall control of immunity. So 60–65% of all people are suffering from atopic have some food allergy. It's again connected. Even the method of birth giving influences the structure of microbiome for the newly born child. A child which is born through Caesar section has much worse microbiome than a child born in a natural way. And it's logical, because during the passage through the birth canal, they get inoculated by the bacteria from the mother. In some countries, such as Denmark or Belgium, at some university hospitals, what they do is that if a child is born through Caesarean section, they take scrapings from the vagina and smear it onto the child. Our philosophy here is to wash the child and disinfect it, unlike in the West, where their style is becoming more sophisticated, even though it might seem barbarian or something. But the proper colonization is crucial. Another thing that influences our microbiome is the type of the diet, the style of eating. If we look at an infant, a suckling baby, healthy baby, has about 90% of bifidobacteria. If you look at the microbiome of a child that receives artificial food, their number is much reduced. And on the contrary, they have more various Clostridia, E. coli, Streptococcus, and other bacteria that may not be positive. The same then applies to the adulthood. So once the child leaves the mother's milk and starts eating normal food, the microbiome experiences a radical change. And what we eat, what we send to the guts, what we feed the bacteria with, influences the structure of the microbiome, and I will talk about it later. Obviously, last but not least, our microbiome is influenced by the environment we live in. So, if you look at dog keepers or cat keepers, who keeps dogs or cats here? Can you raise your hands? So here you can see what wonderful migration can be found between your pet and yourselves. Up to 50% of the structural microbiome might be similar with your pet. This is how close you can be with your pets. There are many other studies of the specifics of the environment and how that influences our microbiome. If you look at the microbiome of the Japanese, you can find bacteria able to break the celluloses from algae. You wouldn't find anything like that with any European. So this has been determined by the development and the symbiosis of the human being with the environment. If we look at the skin microbiome, again a great study that I found entertaining. The scientists try to analyze microbes of the members of a family and to determine how similar they are or dissimilar. So they took scrapings from the face, from the armpits, feet and hands, and found that the largest similarity is not in the face or hands or anywhere, but it's on the feet soles. Then they were wondering why, and they discovered that it probably, as people walk barefoot at home all the time, our bacteria end up on the floor, and whoever walks after us sticks them to his or her own feet. In any way, the microbiome of each of us is quite unique. As I had it on the first slide when I said that we all have our microbiome makeup, it's true. If a criminal leaves a sample of his or her stool, I can guarantee that 100% we can identify him. We don't need any fingerprints. So I'll try to run through this really quickly, not to spoil your morning, because you may feel that this is too distant from our topic or from the topic of ESSENS Bio, but you will see how far we get. I said that a human being is one huge fermenter or bioreactor. When we cultivate bacteria in our labs, it's like an analogy with an intestine. It's a vessel in which we've got cultivating media, like our bowels, where the medium is formed by our food. And on that medium, or in it, we cultivate the bacteria. And obviously the fermentor, apart from having the input, it's got also the output. So time to time these bacteria need to be let out. If the fermentor is healthy, the huge amount of bacteria represents a huge therapeutic potential. So by this I am actually touching the fecal transplantations, which are still rare, but they are performed even here in the university hospital in Brno. It's a form of therapy which is experiencing a great boom. It's based on transferring the stool from a healthy donor into the body of the patient. It's disgusting, but on the other hand, it's got a huge therapeutic potential. If you look at Clostridia infections, these are infections that threaten the life of the patient. Patients after long-term antibiotic treatment, after operations, after car accidents, if they get this infection, they can die from it. So what the modern medicine cannot handle can be handled by one healthy human feces or scraping, to be more cultivated, because these people who are actually dying are healthy by the second day. The success rate 92–93%. We deal with this as well, but from the legislation point of view, it's a huge problem. The State Control Office accepts the therapy, but only for some infections, and now it's becoming more and more clear that, and it's not typical for this country, but mostly in the Western countries, they show the great potential. So we are actually wasting here great medical material. The city of Brno, I learned it from my friend who worked for the garbage collecting company. So Brno, as the city, throws out about 70 tons of this precious medical material. 70 tons a day. Why I'm telling you this? Because the more variable the probiotic is, the more potential it has. If you look at the microbiome and its structure in the patients, there is zero potential. If you look at the microbiome of the donor, you can see a huge difference at first sight. And if the patient gets this dose of the transplanted matter, after 2 weeks, there is a convergence of the microbiome structure. This is why I'm saying this. We will obviously never get close to this state of the microbiome transplant, but ESSENS has been selected in such a way to present a combination of the largest therapeutic potential. It contains the best combination of these matters that's available on the market. Obviously, this is an utterly civilized and sophisticated form of this microbiome therapy, because on the other hand, well, what they do in the hospitals, they mix the stool and then put it in the patient, so per rectum. So that's how it is. Otherwise, I have one more hot topic that concerns the intestinal microbiome, and the problem of today's modern population is the syndrome of leaky gut, or the permeable intestine. Most of us suffer from that without realizing it, and it's closely connected to the intestinal microflora. If you look at this picture, you can see what a healthy mucous membrane should look like. It must be sealing perfectly, separating the internal content of our fermenter from the blood vessels from our internal body. However, this frequently goes wrong, and this situation happens. Then the intestine is becoming permeable, and those people actually have all the matters from the intestines through the mucous membrane into the underlying layer. The matters get into the blood and burden our body. So if we look at obese people, for example, obesity is 100% cases connected to the leaky gut. If you take the blood from an obese person and analyze the inflammation markers of it, obesity is always connected with chronic inflammation, even though it's a mild, and it starts in the intestine. How does inflammation evoke or generate obesity? The point is that these bacteria that are lipopolysaccharides or endotoxins get through the mucous membrane into the immunity system, links to certain receptors, and what's created is a complex which activates adipocytose tissue, which is a precursor of the adipose tissue or fat. That's why the obesity treatment should start primarily with the microbiome. And again, we approach it logically. The first thing we change is the diet, because the diet changes the intestinal microflora, but we should always include prebiotic supplementation. Studies clearly show that if an obese person starts using probiotics and doesn't change the lifestyle and continues acting the same way, just the supplementation reduces the weight by 5%. Obviously, it has its limits, but it's a clear proof that we should start on the level of the intestine. We focus a lot on the research of the modern food, which is rather sterile. I'll mention more about our experiments that we performed in the 9-bit laboratory. But to prove the importance of our diet, how it changes the microbiome, I took a study which was performed on volunteers taken from South Africa, black population, and these people ate their typical local food. This is listed here. Here it is. Sorry. And then they took, well, these people ate a lot of fiber, vegetables, spinach, corn, red peppers, and so on, a very limited amount of meat. And then they took a group of black Americans who lived the typical Western lifestyle, a lot of fast food, sausages, hamburgers, French fries, minced meat and rice. I don't know what minced rice is, whatever. However, the study analyzed the microbiome at the beginning. Took the microbiome, measured its butyrate content, which is a fat acid produced by our bacteria in the intestines, and this acid is very important because it feeds the intestinal epithelium, forming 70% of all energy source. And they did the same for both groups. At the same time, they also looked at the inflammation markers that could be present in the intestines. And they discovered that the African Americans, 100% of their cases had increased markers for inflammations, indicating some sort of an inflammation process in the intestines. The Aborigines had much lower markers. And the whole experiment was based on swapping the diet for these volunteers. Those who ate healthily started eating unhealthily and vice versa. And I can't remember whether it was 2 or 3 weeks. Radical changes occurred in the microbiome. Those who lived healthily started eating the Western modern food. Suddenly, the variability of the intestinal microbiome reduced, the function of the butyrates reduced that feeds the mucal membrane, and inflammation processes appeared in their intestines. And on the contrary, those people that originally ate unhealthily and started eating the aboriginal food, the production of butyrate increased, the variability of the microbiome increased, and the inflammation process is reduced in the intestines. So this is to stress how important it is to have healthy food and balanced food. This food, the American one, is very much sterile. Microorganisms do not exist in it. This food is full of probiotics, full of bacteria. It's not sterile and means a permanent intake or permanent impulses for our life. Just for your information, there was another study published when volunteers started eating or being on a single-day McDonald's diet. Please cut it off so that no one sues me. These studies showed clearly that a single-day change of the food generates radical change in the microbiome. The moment once they started eating French fries, Coca-Cola, hamburgers, the change was visible for their microbiome. So our bacteria are very dynamic and respond to what we feed them, how we behave to them. So I would like to stress, we have a certain genetic predisposition. To a certain extent, I can say that our intestinal microbiome or microflora can be a little bit inherited if we were born in a natural way, or we still get it from our parents in spite of the environment. But what's crucial and what's elementary is us. We, as we approach the life, as we eat, we determine what sort of bacteria will multiply in our intestines, how they are going to control or not control the processes in our bodies. It is the crucial information. And now we are getting to what I enjoy a lot. I call it funky science, enjoyable science. I got inspired by a Google article where a newspaper woman published a short report in which she monitored how a hamburger doesn't go off from a fast food chain. I'm not going to name them not to get sued. It was inspirational for me. I bought this hamburger 4 years ago as well, and I left it in the car, but I will show it later on. It's 4-year-old and it's still okay. I didn't want to pass it through the crowd here to make sure I don't lose it. But I'll show you. I really do have it here. There's nothing wrong with it. The hamburger, I still remember, it cost 25 crowns. And if you put it in a microwave oven, obviously it's dried. So if you heat it up, it would still be edible. There's nothing wrong with the meat. Nothing happened to this carbonara. So if even the wild types of bacteria or fungi don't eat it, how could the noble microflora deal with it? It will have a great problem with it. And imagine that many people have it as one of the components of their diet. The microbiome must look terrible. So we performed loads of experiments. This is just for your entertainment. We tested various fast food types, Kung Pao. We watched the UHT box-packed milk, upperized with long shelf life. Many interesting results. What I found really sad, I love beer, and unfortunately beer inhibits the bacteria. On the other hand, it was an inspiration to develop probiotics for beer. What we found really interesting is the difference of the value that we introduced. We are the only one in the world. It's a prebiotic index of food. The prebiotic index means how much the friendly bacteria can feed or multiply on this food. Let's go to the history. Our forefathers long time ago knew that cabbage, cucumbers are cloned to ferment, so that's what they created. And this means that these types of food or vegetables should be ideal substrate for the bacteria, I mean malolactic bacteria. And we found an interesting result. If you look at the comparison of the prebiotic food index that we bought in the supermarket and this index on vegetables from the garden of my grandmother, and when we compared these values side by side, the cucumber from the supermarket grew 10 times less friendly bacteria, and the lettuce from the supermarket grew 100 times less bacteria than the food from the home garden. Frequently we go to the supermarket, buy vegetables and fruits and believe that we are doing something good for our intestines. Obviously we are doing good, but it's not optimal. We don't know the reason. I still do not know. There may be many factors because they collect the fruits and vegetables not ripe enough. It's treated by many chemical stabilizers, waxes. And again, the problem is that we actually eat frequently sterile foods, in spite of needing everyday supply of friendly bacteria for the immunity system and for our physiological processes to be controlled by them. By this, we are getting back more than 100 years ago. You may have heard the name of Ilya Mechnikov, who was a French scientist who won the Nobel Prize for discovering probiotics or discovering the positive effect of probiotics. He got the Nobel Prize for proving at the beginning of the 20th century that eating of the probiotic bacteria, which can be found in fermented milk products and fermented vegetables and so on, has a very positive effect on the human health and increases the quality of life. Because he compared the Eastern Bulgarian shepherd-like nations that regularly ate fermented milk products or fermented food, and he compared their health state with the health state of the then modern Western Europe. And this way he proved that eating of these products protects people from the increased risk of oncologic diseases, autoimmune diseases and so on. Sometimes we fight the EU because the European Union, obviously it allows us to travel and trade freely, but on the other hand some regulations are nonsense. If you look at probiotics, the World Health Organization clearly defines probiotics being positive to human health if served in adequate amounts. Unlike the EU, which is much more clever, they actually ban the use of the word probiotics. Believe it or not, we have better clerks in this than in the EU because they tolerate it. But if you travel to France, for example, there was a phase in France when the state could not use or were not allowed to sell any products that would be called probiotics. That's how far it can go. Our Synbio actually doesn't do anything else than link to to what Lila Mechnikov discovered a long time ago, or even our forefathers long time ago, when they actually kept fermented cabbage for winter or had their acid milk and acidified milk products. We are not doing anything else than copying the old evolution experience. If we go back to the fecal transplantation, it's not new either. In China, 2000 years ago, they used it, even though they called it in a vulgar way. They call it yellow soup. I wouldn't want to eat it, but in the historical materials, it's really recorded that this type of treatment was applied to treat serious diarrhea, and intestinal infects in the medieval times were really life-threatening almost all the time. So what we are trying to do by this symbiont product, we are trying to link to the experience of our forefathers and to add some added values that corresponds to the modern knowledge. ESSENS contains, apart from probiotics, which is the friendly bacteria, it also contains prebiotics. There is a difference between pro and prebiotics. So pro is friendly bacteria, pre is the fodder for the bacteria, what we feed them with. Probiotics are indigestible part of food. It's usually a certain form of fiber, which is called soluble fiber. We are not able to digest the fiber, and it's not a source of energy for us. It gets through the small intestine into the more remote parts and to the large intestine, where it is fermented. The intestinal bacteria use it as source of their energy. So by the soluble fiber, we can actually systematically support the friendly bacteria. When we eat meat, we support Clostridia. Some types can be really important for us and are healthy, but also we support Clostridia like Clostridium difficile, which is definitely not healthy. Fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides support mainly lactobacilli and mainly bifidobacteria, which means those type of bacteria that form 90% of the microbiome in healthy children. We obviously performed numerous experiments with prebiotics because it's quite difficult to titrate them correctly. This modern population is not used to prebiotics. If we go to the history, try to guess how much our forefathers who lived on hunting and collecting food, how many grams of soluble fiber they ate, those prebiotics. 5%? No, try in grams. 100? You are very close. Our forefathers, it's estimated that they would daily eat about 140 grams of soluble fiber. And now try to guess how much a modern person eats of these per day in average. Again, good guess. This lady said 20, yes, about 14 grams, 10 times less. So primarily we very negatively influence the microbiome by what we eat. It's got its disadvantages. If we are not used to it, obviously there is a big complication because the fermentation generates a lot of carbon dioxide and hydrogen. When we tested it in the laboratory, and we always test everything on us, so I guarantee that we had one working week, we all had to close ourselves in our separate laboratories, and we were not allowed to get out or to share the rooms, so we really had to separate each other or from each other. Obviously we tested very high doses on ourselves, and then it's really tough. Uncontrolled discharges of gas. The fermentation really, you could feed an LPG station with that. But if we go back to a more serious topic, I said that we influence our microflora by what we eat, by the environment we live in, and by numerous matters, especially medicine and preservatives that we have in our food. Antibiotics are one of those important factors that lead to a radical change of the microbiome. I'm not against antibiotics because I believe they have their position within the modern medicine. They saved hundreds of millions of lives, no question about that. On the other hand, the problem is that they are not used reasonably. When I was a child, when I had an inflammation, I caught a cold, my mother would automatically get antibiotics from the doctor. So my generation is immune to antibiotics and our microbiome is not in order. Great studies show, and these are again done on volunteers who took combination of 3 antibiotics. Their microbiome was analyzed before the supplementation was introduced, and then an analysis after 4 years. What was discovered? That at the beginning of the supplementation, in both intestine and throat, there were no resistant bacteria to be found. After the volunteers started using the antibiotics, the 3rd day, both in the intestine and throat, there were resistant bacteria. And on top of that, some types of bacteria disappeared. And what's alarming, that when the analysis of microbiome was performed after 4 years, both in the intestine and throat, the resistant bacteria still existed, and the bacteria that had disappeared, that was killed out by the antibiotics, never returned. This means that the change of the microbiome could be permanent. And for that reason, it's not an exception that we see cases when a patient goes through a radical treatment through antibiotics and then they develop rheumatoid arthritis, non-specific intestinal inflammation or atopic dermatitis. So the initiator could be the antibiotics. Today, it's very popular to treat stomach ulcers. Unfortunately, there is no alternative. So these 3 combinations of antibiotics is applied, but we again see patients that after this treatment with antibiotics, they solved their stomach ulcer, but started numerous other problems, so just beating around. So for that reason, during the antibiotic therapy, there is a good point in using probiotics, and the richer it is, the more it is protected from antibiotics, the better effect it has. So in Assembio, we try to create a composition that would contain the strains suitable to suppress diarrhea during antibiotics, and they are more resistant to antibiotics. The intestinal microbiome influences numerous processes. At the beginning I mentioned immunity, but the microbiome also influences the metabolism of the medicine. So for that reason it's meaningful to combine these medical substances with probiotics, because they can increase the efficiency of the treatment. Why? Because those 2 kilograms of bacteria that we hold in our intestines that have the same metabolic potential as our liver contributes to detoxification of our body. But if we look at our intestine, it's got the same, if not larger, detoxification potential than the liver. My experience from our research, we carried out an analysis for an office somewhere in Slovakia where they transplant liver. They had a female patient, 32-year-old alcoholic with liver cirrhosis, incurable. Not a suitable donor could be found. So when I was there before the end of the last year, we agreed some sort of cooperation, and I was told that the patient most likely would not live till the end of the last year. So we decided to have an experiment approved by the ethical committee and perform the fecal microbiome transplantation. We analyzed the microbiome before the transplantation and after. Believe me or not, the patient was back at home in February. everybody was staring at that in disbelief. No one understood how this was possible. There could be numerous factors. I'm not saying that this is just through the microbiome transplantation, but it's at least something interesting that to protect the liver microbiome is crucial. If the microbiome is bad, poorly constituted, you can meet people who have permanent increased liver tests in spite of living healthily, not drinking, not eating fat food, they sport, and still the liver tests perform negative results. Why? Because they have, obviously, unless they underwent hepatitis or a different health issue, it could be connected to microbiome. Unfortunately, they have bacteria or higher concentrations of bacteria that produce ammonia, picresol, or other metabolites, acetaldehyde, alcohol. So these people are under the influence of alcohol permanently in spite of not drinking. You could really measure the increased concentration of alcohol, and that's the process of the intestinal fermentation. In spite of not drinking, they burden their liver. So just for your interest, I've selected a few medical drugs that are influenced by the microflora. Statins, the most used medicine, huge business. These drugs are very much dependent on the intestinal microflora. So if a patient goes through antibiotic treatment, the conversion efficiency of the medical drug can be reduced through the microflora. And in those cases, it makes sense to use probiotics. The same cytostatic drugs, oncologic treatment. The Masaryk Oncologic Office here in Brno has a center for treating oncologic diseases and research. And it's known now that a patient who goes through chemotherapy and has complications, has to use antibiotics, the efficiency of the chemotherapy is reduced because of that. And the only reason is that the microflora has been damaged, and the microflora influences the effect of the medical drugs more than we admit. We used to have Lachema here in Brno that had its own research as the only one in Central Europe that developed their cytostatic drugs. Unfortunately, it died out, and these cytostatics depend on the intestinal microflora. If we look at diabetes, the number one, metformin as a treatment, daily issued by pharmacies. Metformin does not work in any other way than changing the population of the intestinal bacteria. So we really, using the ESSENS, we try to support the healthy microflora and support the conversion of the medical drugs for the treatment. Today we are experiencing what I call microbiome revolution or genocide of microbes. It's a disorder of our microbiome. It's a long-term problem. Last 40-50 years since antibiotics were discovered, since we've been using preservatives, artificial sweeteners, chemical sweeteners. These change our intestinal microbiomes, and especially preservatives and antibiotics have the biggest role. So if we add it to how we come to the world, as the number of birth givings through the cesarean section is increasing, then the microbiome, which is normally transferred to the children, can be diluted, and children do not receive the proper dose that they should get. And for that reason, if you look at the increased incidence of the intestinal inflammations, Crohn's disease, atopic dermatitis, allergies, asthma, all these go hand in hand with this. And one of the first steps that we should take is the modulation of the microflora, changing it and supplying the friendly bacteria into our intestines. And that's the reason why, after several years of research, we introduced a new product to the market. ESSENS is a unique product containing probiotics of new generation in a very rich mixture that we try to actually go as close as possible to the transplantate on a very serious scientific level. Then it's a unique combination of prebiotics and an adhesive component. Probiotics, the most important part of that, one capsule of ESSENS contains 35 billion of living probiotic bacteria. 35 billion, imagine this dose, a huge number. So it is the strongest probiotic in the market. 16 probiotic strains, it's quite unique. Again, we try to create a mixture that would be similar to the transplantate. Considering the efficiency of the strains, we selected the strains that have studies towards different indications. So you can find strains in the product that are suitable for patients suffering from atopic dermatitis. There are strains suitable for patients with ulcerative colitis, then strains for patients who suffer from repeated inflammations of breathing apparatus, and there are many clinical studies. So this mixture is really rich. There are strains suitable for the modification of energetic metabolism in the intestines, for treatment of diabetes or obesity. So in this we are very unique. And to add more to this, we have developed, and I admit that this was sort of a coincidence, when we were researching in a different project, we discovered a combination of agents that significantly increase the adhesiveness of probiotics on the mucous membrane of intestines. So this is patented, unique thing in which we use probiotic glue, but it's not a glue, it's an adhesive component that increases the adhesiveness of probiotic bacteria to the intestine. If you buy a normal probiotics in a pharmacy, frequently it works on the principle of go in, go through, leave out, don't cause any problems. And the problem is that the bacteria don't get stuck to the intestine, just fly through. They can add something good, but the effect is very limited. Our probiotics, thanks to the adhesive component, increase the intensity of maintenance within the intestine several times more. Again, from the purely scientific point of view, no probiotics can achieve a permanent change of the microbiome. Once you stop using it, the bacteria from the probiotics are excreted from the intestine. It's just a matter of several days. For that reason, it's very important to apply the supplementation long term. Many people, many clients believe that if I have a problem, I start eating probiotics and I'll be okay after 2 days. That's a completely naive idea. Imagine that we have the microbiome disordered by permanent effect of negative matters and we want to cure it in 2 days. It's not realistic. The change comes slowly, gradually. But with the patients that have chronic diarrhea, after 2 weeks or 1 week or 2 weeks, the stool can be modified radically. On the other hand, as I've already met a woman here, the probiotics can cause something which is like a more frequent stool, or it's similar. It's a reaction of the intestine to the detoxification process. Inside, we are really toxified a lot by the metabolites, the bad bacteria, and the probiotic culture suddenly can clean it. So there is a cleaning process, and it can happen that when we start using probiotics, we go more frequently to the toilet. But everything should go back to normal and normalize. When it comes to atopic dermatitis patients, after about a month, they should watch or see at least least a small improvement of the symptoms. And again, it's determined by the fact that we keep the bacteria in the intestine for long term. They get glued to the intestinal wall, and the bacteria can regulate or control the immunity processes. What's also unique is the form of some of the strains. We have biofilm probiotics, which is a probioticum containing the bacteria in the same structure as they can be found in our intestines. The bacteria can then resist much better to the low pH in the stomach. If you take a traditional probioticum in the tracheal capsule, it dissolves in the stomach. 1.2 pH in the stomach causes that 50–60% of the bacteria die out. Thanks to the enterosolvent modification, which means the special capsule that protects the probiotics, and thanks to the structure of the biofilm, we get the majority of the bacteria through the small intestine into remote parts of it and to the colon, especially the colon. That's the generator of the problems. That's where we need the probiotic bacteria. So here you can see it. It may not be that well visible, but the bacteria is really glued to the surface of the carrier in the probiofilm on the mucous membrane. If we look at the functions of the pro and prebiotics, thanks to their combination of prebiotics and probiotic cultures, we achieve large or broad scale of potentially therapeutic indications. I'll also mention something about the prebiotics. They are the source of energy for our friendly bacteria. Chew the prebiotics and spit out numerous agents like butyrate. Butyrate is crucial. The prebiotics that are part of ESSENS generate a lot of butyrate. Butyrate reduces the chronic inflammation processes and closes the intestinal mucous membrane because it's the source of energy for this. So if we look at the indications, radical reduce of the load of kidneys and liver, because the process of detoxification starts in the colon, because otherwise the body is loaded with loads of toxins based on what we eat. It reduces the chronic inflammations, not in the colon only, but in the whole body. So it's not only the non-specific intestinal inflammations, but we can include various inflammations of the skin, repeated inflammations of the urinary tract, and all those types. All these are connected to the probiotics, and we can significantly support the immunity of the system by probiotics. Repeated colds or respiration system inflammations, all of them are connected with a change of the intestinal microflora, and we have probiotics in ESSENS. They've been clinically tested as reducing the incidence of these infects of the respirational system. Then the natural support of the colon motility. There are people among us who go to stool 6 or 7 times a day and they see it as normal, and it is not normal. But there are also people who go once in 3 or 4 days, which is also not correct. The pro and prebiotic supplementation helps us to modify the frequency of emptying the bowels. And even if there is not a radical difference in the frequency, but in case of constipation we change the proportion of bacteria. If the stool stays in the colon for a long time, it increases the risk of generation of carcinogenous matters that could generate tumors, and by probiotics we can eliminate or reduce this. If you look at patients with ulcerous Crohn's disease, the statistics are radical. The chronic inflammation in the colon obviously leads to, after I think 50 years of the disease, every second patient ends up with a tumor or cancer in the colon. Any chronic inflammation increases the risk of oncological diseases. So this is prebiotics, short-chain fatty acids, butyrate. Well, talking about butyrate, it itself, as it is created by the fermentation, increases the sensitivity of tissues to insulin. So prebiotics and probiotics should be the first option for patients who suffer from pre-diabetes, which means that's the initial phase of diabetes of the second type. The butyrate increases the sensitivity of the tissues to insulin. And numerous recent studies also show that the butyrate regulates or controls the multiplication of cells. Apart from serving as a source of energy for them, it also works like an inspector of the life cycle of cells. Once it starts splitting uncontrollably, it kills it. Here you can see how significantly the prebiotics can increase the prebiotic index of foods, which means that if we add fructooligosaccharides and galactooligosaccharides, we support the multiplication of the friendly bacteria on different media. Here you can see different types of foods like oat meats, bread, we tested potato salad, banana, coffee, Coca-Cola. Always this blue column indicates the probiotics without the feeding stuff, and the dark column shows how the bacteria multiplication increased when we added the prebiotic component. So you can see that each, even potentially dangerous food can be turned into something healthy just by supplying the wanted component. We have two types of prebiotics. These are fructooligosaccharides and galactooligosaccharides. Fructooligosaccharides simulate the soluble fiber and are of herb origin made of chicory, and galactooligosaccharides are agents that can be found in the breast milk. They do not generate any allergies to lactose because they are based on it, but they basically simulate the supply of the prebiotic components that a small child gets into the intestines to multiply the bifidogenic bacteria, those healthy ones. So, if we look at the conclusion now, the indications of ESSENS are quite broad, because today we know that the intestinal microbiome contributes to all factors of our lives. The increase of immunity, cardiovascular diseases, I haven't mentioned those. If you look at atherosclerotic plaques, due to the permeability of the membrane in mouth or in the intestines, what happens? That matters get in the blood that could contribute to cardiovascular diseases. Molecularly biological analysis of those atherosclerosis plaques shows that 100% of those plaques contain microbial DNA from Chrysonomus bacteria, which is a bacteria that should not be in the blood at all. And again, it's the result of the microbiome being not balanced. Either the bacteria multiplies in the mouth or theoretically in the intestines, and the membrane lets it through. It's not actually sealing enough. So numerous cardiovascular diseases start on the oral or intestinal microbiome. And if we don't take care of it, we can eat statins and whatever, and those have many side effects, but we will never get to the core of the issue. We will not deal with the root of the problem. Mental health, memory, well, intestine and brain, there is this link. Autoimmune diseases, allergies, asthma, one of those typical target indications from the probiotic supplementation. I'm not going to tell you nonsense that we will cure everything. In many cases, we really do actually solve the problem, but often the probiotic supplementation helps the reduction of the symptoms. If someone suffers from ulcerative colitis and he or she is in the remission phase, which is the quiet time of 6 or 10 months, it makes a big difference whether you are okay for 6 months or for 10 months. Everybody who's experienced these problems knows exactly what I'm talking about. If these people suffer from these inflammations, they cannot live their homes, they have to be closed. Their diarrhea is so intensive that they are disqualified from normal life. Prevention of oncological disease, especially in this relationship to the colon, because we are pushing the bacteria by the probiotic, those that could be potentially dangerous and increase the production of carcinogenous matters. Healthy bones, osteoporosis. Prebiotics increase the availability of calcium. So for ossification of bones, key thing. The studies also show that some of the lactobacilli regulate the processes that contribute to ossification or storing the calcium in the bones. And to conclude with, healthy digestion, that's linked to the intestine. So if we take it like this, vertically, the product has been really developed for both junior young people or for seniors, elder people, across the full spectrum. So, last but not least, when it comes to the use, I forgot those. What's ideal, if possible? In the morning, empty stomach, before you start eating. If it doesn't suit you, you can have problems with that for various reasons. Try to eat them during your first meal. By using probiotics after the meal, you reduce the number of living cells that could go through. Here you can see the reason, but this is information from a scientific publication. I don't want to burden you with that. Ideally, use them before meal. That's enough what you need to know. That's the key thing, because if you eat probiotic before your meal, this indicates the number of surviving bacteria, and this is after the meal. This means a difference in the multitude of 3. In other words, 1,000 times less bacteria can get into the intestine. ESSENS microbiome caps protects the health of all of us. We actually have been working on that very long to make it unique. And to conclude, a small encouragement. If you ever feel like everybody has left you, the whole world doesn't care for you, you don't have a single friend, you are not alone. Believe that. You've got trillions of friends in your intestines that love you and will fight for you so that you are okay, because they need you. Thank you for your attention. Obviously, I've been using probiotics long term. I would be against myself not to use them. I can say my personal experience when it comes to the modification of the frequency of emptying my bowels, the effect is visible. What I stressed, that it's not always like in 1 day or in 2 weeks. When it comes to the diet, I should be rebuked for that, because I admit that sometimes I do visit McDonald's. Beer, yeah, I love beer. Wine, well, being in South Moravia, obviously I do drink wine, so it's not optimal for the microbiome, but on the other hand, if you drink more beer, the probiotics actually support your intestines and the detoxification is much more pleasant and smooth. Okay, so thank you very much again and a big applause.